Hey fam, I want you to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications. So let's talk about Camelot's End. So for a lot of people who are not political junkies, look, they know Carter was president, then of course ran against Reagan, he lost, and people said Carter was a horrible president. And so what really were you trying to achieve with this book?
You know, I did not, Roland, set out to write this book to tell a lesson, to like impart some, to impart some lesson to people. I really was attracted to it because I thought it was a great story. And I know that sounds maybe a little hokey, but I was born in '77, 3 years before all this went down. And I heard about this story back in 2013. I was at a Democratic meeting here in D.C. I ran into two operatives who were at the convention in 1980, which is the photo on the cover. And they tell me the story about, hey, Jimmy Carter, on the last night of the convention, was chasing a drunk Ted Kennedy around the stage on live national television.
Right.
And I said, really? That happened? And so it was just a series of moments where I just thought, wow, that really happened. And actually, a few minutes after I heard that story, I ran into Anita Dunn, who worked she was a young person in the Carter White House at that time, went on to become an advisor to Obama. And she told me about how this whole fight divided the Democrats throughout the 1980s and into the 90s. And so I thought, okay, there's a lot of really interesting stuff there that we don't know about 1980 or we don't focus on because everybody just talks about Ronald Reagan.
Right.
And there's some historical scope there. And as I got into it, I realized, okay, 1980 was the point at which the Democratic coalition that had kept them in power as the dominant party since 1932 and the New Deal until basically 1980. That's when it really kind of finally fractured because the Democrats lost the South pretty much for good. I mean, Clinton won it back some in the 90s, but that coalition never came back.
Well, what was interesting, though, but not even just focused on 1980, was as I was reading this book, people also don't quite understand that here you had Carter, who runs for president from the Deep South.
Yeah.
You're just coming out of the Black Freedom Movement, the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah.
And so what really, which I had not really understood before, was Carter appealing to racists, appealing to that George Wallace wing of the party to ensure that he got elected governor, but then also having to still appeal to them to be elected president.
Yeah. Yeah, so in 1966, he runs for governor and loses. He ran as a moderate on race in that year, and 4 years later, he had learned his lesson. And in 1970, he runs for governor of Georgia and runs a campaign that in some ways overtly appeals to the George Wallace white supremacist vote, and in other ways, he kind of looks the other way, as some of his operatives put out flyers showing Sanders, his opponent in the Democratic primary, getting champagne poured over his head by a black member of the Atlanta Hawks. And Sanders himself, who was the former governor, said, this is them trying to make me look like I love African Americans. And he didn't use the word African Americans. And so, what's really interesting about the difference between 66 and 70 is the fact that Carter had a spiritual awakening in the wake of 1966. He spent time knocking on doors and proselytizing on behalf of a Baptist church up in Massachusetts, and had basically a born-again Christian experience during that time, while he was also reading Christian philosopher Reinhold Niebuhr, who allowed him to kind of wed a realpolitik, pragmatic lens to this sense of I am divinely sort of, sent out to be a politician. There's a lot there that I'm talking about, and I'm going to get to the presidential in a minute, but I think what you have there is that he was willing to look past some of the ugly elements of his 1970 campaign on race by seeing himself as somebody who was on a mission from God in some ways.
But it speaks to, though, this reality of our politics.
Yeah.
That that many of these candidates could not run
Absolutely.
as purists, could not run as fully embracing a white Southerner, fully embracing the issue of civil rights. It's not like in Jimmy Carter's history, he was this bigoted man who joined the Klan.
Right.
That wasn't the whole deal.
Right.
But in essence, he had to make a deal with the devil.
That's right.
That if I want to ascend to higher office, I'm It's going to be another white guy who will.
If I don't, there will be a real racist who's the governor. And in fact, when Carter wins this election, there are reports he was not happy with the campaign that he had to run. He was a little depressed about it. And he went on to give a speech in his inaugural address where he said the time for racial division. I can't remember the exact phrase he used. Do you remember it? But he basically said that the time for racial white superiority is over.
And then all of a sudden, the racists were going like, yo, dude, what the hell?
Exactly.
We just voted for you.
So he pulled a bait and switch on the white supremacists. There's a lot of moral complexity here to the idea of running a campaign that is doing things that are ugly in order to, in some ways, defeat those elements. And
when you think of Jimmy Carter today, people think of quiet, soft, meek, Habitat for Humanity, him still teaching Bible study. But the reality is, I mean, this was a hardcore, I'm going to get what I want politician.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. There were people that said, don't pay attention to that smile. That smile does not mean a thing. Because I think it's helpful to remember, he grew up in rural Georgia, southwest Georgia. He grew up on a farm. His dad was a successful farmer, but they grew up without toilet paper. Mm-hmm. They grew up without running water and electricity until he was about 10 or 12 years old. And he just willed himself to the Naval Academy. He willed himself up the chain in the Navy, and he willed himself into the state Senate. He had to overcome some incredible barriers just to even get into the state Senate in Georgia, and then he became governor, all by just sheer force of will. And when you add in the stuff that he incorporated into his worldview through Reinhold Niebuhr and that philosophy, you have iron will and then a sense of divine mandate. And the chapter on Hunter S. Thompson, where he talks about Carter giving a populist speech, where this is as governor after he's elected. Right. He's telling the establishment in Georgia, basically, when Martin Luther King came here, you didn't embrace him. You viewed him as a disgrace and as horrible. Mm-hmm. That was a speech that Hunter S. Thompson then took and played for people around the country as an example of how when Carter wanted to be a hard-edged politician, tough as nails, he could do it.
Now, half his book is Jimmy Carter, the other half is Senator Ted Kennedy.
Yeah.
And I saw the movie Chappaquiddick.
Yeah.
I read other books as well. But reading this was the first time I really, in reading it, got an understanding where Ted Kennedy had no clue why in the hell he was running for president. I mean, just reading that transcript, how he just could not answer basic questions. Mm-hmm. It was as if a guy was running, when you talk about divine order, it was sort of like, this is owed to me, but it was also a curse. It was, and I'm just going, was he that bad at answering questions? Mm-hmm. That was just wild.
Yeah, and the Mudd interview, Roger Mudd was the CBS reporter who interviewed him, and everybody remembers that he had a bad answer to the question of why do you want to be president, which is what you're basically getting at right now.
He couldn't answer it.
Yeah, but I think his answer to that question was kind of boilerplate, and everybody talks about that answer as so terrible. If you really look at it just in isolation, it's not a great answer. It's also not a disastrous answer. What it revealed was what you're talking about, which is that he felt entitled to the job. And in the fall of 1979, just before this interview takes place, Jimmy Carter is in so much political trouble. He's 2-1. Democrats favor Kennedy over Carter. And everybody is basically saying, Kennedy is going to have a cakewalk to the nomination. So Kennedy walks into this interview basically thinking, I've got this nomination in hand. I don't have to really think that hard about it. He's also being driven, as you alluded to, by the pressure from the Democratic Party to rediscover the magic of his brothers. And it's these ghosts of his brothers that are kind of hanging over him, driving him forward into something that I don't think he was really sure he wanted to do or could be good at.
Well, first of all, you'd already established, look, he didn't want to run for United States Senate.
Right.
But Dad was making what Dad said. I paid for that seat.
Right.
You're running for it.
Right.
And so here was a guy who his whole life was, the short, fat, chubby one, the one who really wasn't that smart. And it was sort of like, no, you're going to do this. You were forced into it. And so even though you reflect on him being the lying of the Senate and everything,
Because as long as he does that, the other guy will look like a jerk and he'll kind of walk to the nomination. That's sort of a paradigm for a lot of his career. He just had to show up, and even if he got ripped to shreds, like, he would kind of get there by virtue of his family and the name. You look at that life of doing something that you're not really sure you want to do. That had to be part of why he was troubled with alcoholism and a lot of misbehavior in his private life.
And it was stunning to see how these two just did not get along.
Yeah.
And how you get this one figure who was this devout Christian, and then I'm sure he's thinking the person I'm talking to is just the paragon of evil. And then Kennedy is probably thinking, I got this self-righteous SOB who thinks he knows what's best.
Right.
And they just flat out did not like each other.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because Carter's self-righteousness still is a problem for him today. I was just talking earlier today with Jen Palmieri, who was an advisor to Clinton. We had a long conversation about a number of things, but we ended up talking about this book, and she said all of the ex-presidents really don't like Jimmy Carter. Obama, both Bushes, Clinton, none of them like him because of his self-righteousness. And that was part of why Kennedy didn't like him. Kennedy also probably just thought, I mean, we have information that tells us this, that Kennedy felt like he was out of his depth and he didn't know what he was doing. And he was wrecking an opportunity for Democrats to take the country in a positive direction at a time when the country really badly needed leadership.
Well, it's hilarious to me, though, when you say that, because even though Carter was very hardcore politician.
Yeah.
I've often said that Democrats have made a mistake by pushing Jimmy Carter to the side.
Yeah.
I've always believed they made that mistake because here is someone who has had an amazing post-presidency, a person who can offer a vision that is not necessarily driven by politics.
Yeah.
And I'm going to get to a second where the issue of character came up. But really somebody who can issue a clarion call where self-righteousness is important. And I think if you look at Clinton and Obama, your Democratic presidents, I think you look at folks who were deal makers, individuals who didn't necessarily have that. And I think his faith is a huge part of it.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't understand how you have a Democrat who was former president, who's a strong evangelical, and you don't use him.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's the dumbest thing in the world to me. I've never understood that.
I agree. I think we do a disservice to ourselves when we talk about Jimmy Carter in such a one-dimensional way. We've touched on his weaknesses, but as you mentioned, his post-presidency has been remarkable and exemplary, and he's done an incredible amount of good. And I think when you even talk about it in terms of electoral, pragmatic politics, let's look at 2020. Let's look at, you and I have talked about this. Are there Trump voters out there that could go for a Democratic nominee? That's open to debate. But I would say that the way that Democrats have been positioning themselves on abortion of late is reducing the number of people who are in that pool of people who voted for Trump that could vote for a Democrat. Because let's face it, I grew up in a family that was largely apolitical, largely white evangelical fundamentalist, and our lack of political involvement was augmented by one issue, abortion. And that shaped our political worldview. Now, I've done a lot of work over the last few decades to become aware of the full world of politics, and I've had a lot of experience in that. But I still talk to family members who are in that world, and they're not like in the hills of Kentucky. They live in Montgomery County, Maryland, 30 miles north of here. So I think that's one issue where where the Democratic Party has not done a good job on faith.
And here's where I think it comes in. And in fact, in reading this, I said anybody running for the presidency today who's a Democrat should actually be using this playbook. Here you say, Carter and his advisors discussed the need for moral leadership in the country in the wake of the Vietnam War. And then as you continue, he talks again about the idea of moral leadership with Nixon, the issue of character.
Yeah.
I read that, and that's in pages 83 to 89, and what jumped out at me was I said, if I'm running for president right now, that is exactly how I'm going to frame it with Donald Trump. That it's not even really about what you lay out here. It really wasn't even about Carter laying out, these are my policy, this is where we need to go. What he was saying is, after Nixon, character matters in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
And I absolutely saw, I was just reading it, I could literally hear a candidate in 2019, 2020 making the same argument saying, sure, you can say, oh, God, I've got a great tax cut and this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
But this man does not have the character to be president.
Yeah, and it's an open question whether that's going to happen to me, because Priorities USA, they're a huge Democratic group. They just put out a huge polling memo this week saying we've got to focus on the economy. I agree, the economy is a big deal.
See, I think they're wrong. I think, see, this to me is where, again, if you take the self-righteousness of Jimmy Carter,
yeah.
You've got independents who are completely turned off by Trump's tweets, the sucking up to North Korean leader, all this sort of stuff like this. This is where you can make an argument that's not policy, that's not partisan,
right?
That's not left, right, red, blue,
right.
That's not south, north, east coast, west coast. The argument is simply, we need to return to a day where you actually trust what the president says.
Yeah.
Return to a day where you wake up and you don't have to ask the question, is he lying today? Where you don't have literally fact checkers going, he's about to approach 10,000 lies in this presidency. I think, again, if they read just those 6 pages and they read how Carter saw the country, I do believe where we are right now is a character, moral leadership question.
Here's where I think the Democratic Party might have a part of a challenge in getting to what you're talking about. Their coalition is two big constituencies in the Democratic coalition are upper educated, suburban whites and African Americans, right? The African American community has a long history of deep, sincere faith, largely Protestant Christian. Younger generations, maybe a little less so.
Yep.
But largely, still, that's a big flavor of the African American community. The upper educated white suburbans, increasingly not as much religious. And so I think there's a challenge there for the Democrats.
So that's why I think it's split, though.
Yeah.
I think when you make the character argument and the moral leadership argument, you're not making a faith argument.
Okay.
What you're making is an argument that return to an America where you want your child to be proud of who is president.
Yeah.
Return to the day when, no matter if they were Republican or Democrat, you didn't wake up saying the president's a liar.
Yeah.
Return to the day where it did matter if the president slept with a porn star. See, I'm not making a faith argument.
Yeah.
I think what jumped out at me was, if you're making a moral character argument, I think what you're saying to America is, we've got to get away from what you guys did, and that is, damn a strong president of moral character like Obama, and let's elect a heathen. And I think Republicans are embarrassed by this guy.
Oh, yeah.
I think certainly independents and Democrats, women as well. I just think if Democrats try to make this a complete policy deal, you're losing the piece where people say, yes, I appreciate the tax cut. Yes, I might like this. Yes, I might appreciate these type of judges, but I simply cannot tolerate the integrity and the character of the person. I just think that that's a thing that if they would read that and understand where Carter was coming from, they would have the ability to, I think, to appeal to some people.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the questions would be how compelling and powerful that message can be without faith, which drove Carter. And it's an open question. I'm not arguing that you can't have a powerful moral message without a sort of faith component to it. I think faith component adds a lot, though.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
As well, because it serves as the foundation of who you are.
Yeah.
You going through this primary, here you got Kennedy and Carter. They're going after each other. And what was crazy to me is reading it, and Carter just dusted Kennedy. And Kennedy wouldn't give up. It was essentially him saying, I'm going to be the complete thorn in your side.
Yeah.
No matter what. Doesn't matter how bad I'm getting beat. Doesn't matter. Whatever the heck, I'm not quitting.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, one person who predicted that Carter was going to whip Kennedy was Henry Kissinger, which is kind of an interesting, little note of history. Carter certainly did things strategically to whip Kennedy, but Carter got a huge assist from the Ayatollah in Iran, because when the hostages were taken this was 3 days before Kennedy announced his candidacy. The hostages in Tehran are taken at the embassy, and overnight, the Iowa caucuses, which are in January, go from Carter versus Kennedy, and now all of a sudden it's Carter versus the Ayatollah, because the voters are looking at this
as rallying behind the President of the United States.
They're looking at this as, if I don't vote for Carter, then I am sort of weakening him at a time when we all need to be behind him as he goes up against the Ayatollah of Iran and the fundamentalists in Tehran who have our people in prison, basically. And so that really made it hard for Kennedy to do anything. He couldn't criticize Carter. He couldn't really talk about the hostages. He couldn't get in the news. And so I was not the best place for a celebrity politician from the Northeast anyway, especially with his background and his baggage. And that just made it really tough sledding for him.
When you take us through going through those primaries and then going to the convention, the whole reset with Kennedy, money and everything along those lines, it was compelling to see how deeply wounded Carter was, and how, in many ways, he was desperate for the validation of Kennedy. He was desperate to not only say, I kicked your ass, but also he needed Kennedy to say, yeah, he beat me, and we're in this thing together. And the fact that Kennedy wouldn't give it to him. I mean, that, as you described that scene of Kennedy's speech, and then when Carter gets a nomination, and then the limo comes, and he's taking his time, and he's bringing everybody else up, and how his whole deal was, I don't give a damn about this guy who's the president.
Right. No, and one historian said it was like Kennedy had showed up at the wedding of his chauffeur with Carter, the incumbent president, who had just given his acceptance speech after winning renomination, as the chauffeur. And, you know, Carter wanted to have the pose, as you mentioned, of hands together with Kennedy. And Kennedy made him chase him around the stage for a good 5 minutes. There are conflicting reports about whether Kennedy was drunk. I've come to believe that Kennedy had definitely been drinking. Bob Shrum, who's probably a mutual friend of ours, says, maybe not, I don't know. But you're looking at me like, no. But Bob Shrum was with Kennedy, and he insists that he wasn't drunk. I've come to believe that it was probably the difference between 2 Jack and Cokes and like 5 Jack and Cokes.
Right.
You know? But yeah, I mean, it was probably the most humiliating moment of Carter's political career.
So if you think about that whole dysfunction between Carter, Kennedy, tearing apart the party, opens the door for Reagan to win.
Right.
What can Democrats today learn from this? Because when you see Clinton folks leaking stuff about Senator Sanders flying charter planes, and them still not being over that, the Sanders people still being pissed off, saying it was stolen from us, and now you have other candidates who are now running as well, and then people are going, yo, you guys, if you keep this up, you're going to guarantee this guy wins.
Right.
What do you think Democrats today, not just people who are running, but actual voters, what should they learn from what the craziness that happened between President Jimmy Carter and Senator Ted Kennedy?
Well, I think there's different lessons for voters, and there's different lessons for Democratic operatives. For the operatives, you're kind of getting to it. There's a difference between really aggressive, robust debate over where the party should be, where the country should be, the qualifications of the candidates, all that. That's all fair game. It's when you start playing dirty that you're probably crossing a line, and it's where you're putting the desire to win ahead of the good of the party and the country, maybe. And I think that's one lesson. I think for the voter, you know, it's not really that different from what I would say to them most of the time, which is keep your eye on the ball. You know, I don't think you really need to read too many stories about which operatives are signing up for who. Keep your eye on which issues you think are most important to the country, and do your homework. Look at what the candidates are saying about the top 5 issues to you. Educate yourself, because it's all out there. And then, you know, do the job you can do with your social network, with your peers, to make these issues on their radar.
Was it surprising to you that these two never really made up?
Not really. The thing that did surprise me was that when I interviewed Carter, I asked him if Ted Kennedy ever kind of got redemption. And he made a comment to me that indicated that he had come a little ways from where he was in the past. Because even 8 years after that election, he couldn't say anything nice about Teddy Kennedy at the ADA convention. But he said something really nice about Ted Kennedy. He said, I don't think he needed redemption. I think he was one of the greatest senators who ever lived. And that was a pretty... I don't think he could have said that 10, 20 years ago.
I still think it's amazing when you think about the political grudges and how they continue, and how even when people try to put them together, how they still never really gelled. And to me, the mistake in that is there's something bigger than you as an individual and your individual rivalry. That when you think about your stars in your party, that's where you say the good of the country must be better than our personal pettiness. And I think that that's one of the things that I think resonates today.
Yeah.
And that is, you can be pissed with the last election,
Right.
but it's the last election.
Yeah.
It's over. If you didn't win, you didn't win. Okay? In the case of Carter, you won, but you won the primary. But you were severely wounded as a result, and you won the biggest thing of all, which was the presidency. For Democrats, you were angry and pissed off at Jimmy Carter because he didn't do this and didn't do that. But what did you end up getting? 12 years of Republican rule.
Right.
Ushered in the moral majority.
Right.
Ushered in Newt Gingrich taking down Speaker of the House Jim Wright, taking over the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And so to me, the lessons are, be very careful who you try to take down today, because you can be taking down a lot more than just that person.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. You've definitely. We've both been around long enough, I think, to not be super surprised by the fact that people's egos can override their better judgment, right? I mean, it's just human nature. I think it speaks to the amount of character that's actually needed to do what you just described. The character is needed in the candidate, and the character is needed in the staff. Mm-hmm. Because you might have a candidate with character who's got staff saying, F that guy.
Yep.
But if you've got both character or candidates and campaign staff with character, you can do the really hard thing, which is to overcome your own personal squabbles. But it's hard. It's hard.
I ask every author this: what was your wow moment in the research in this book? What was that one thing where even you were like, "Yep, wow, that's crazy"? Either I didn't know it, or it shocked you, surprised you, blew you away.
Well, I mentioned the story at the beginning. I was surprised. I was shocked at that of on the stage. I was shocked that Hunter S. Thompson called Carter one of the three meanest men that he had ever met, because that's just not how we think of Carter. I think in a more resonant way, the thing that really surprised me in a deep way was when I began to look at their backgrounds. And I saw how different they were, how radically different they were. And if you buy the book and you look at the photo section, the very first page of photos shows Carter at age 10 or so on his farm, no shirt, no shoes, and the picture quality is terrible. And underneath that is a picture of Kennedy at almost the same age as part of a much bigger family in London, dressed to the nines, living in J.P. Morgan's old house in London, right? So the difference between their upbringing and the fact that they entered politics around the same time.
Right.
And then they began to kind of ascend the ladder at the same time until they finally collided in 1980. And even the collision had about 8 years, 7 or 8 years of run up to that. So that there was like this sense of fate to me that brought them together that I thought was really interesting.
All right, folks, the book is called Camelot's End: Kennedy versus Carter and the Fight That Broke the Democratic Party by Jon Ward. That's the book right there. So you definitely want to check it out. I probably read it in about a week. And so those of you who love politics, I think you would certainly learn a heck of a whole lot. A lot of stuff you were not aware of when you think about these seminal figures, President Jimmy Carter, and, of course, the late Senator Ted Kennedy. John, we appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Roland.
All right.
Appreciate it.
You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. Roland Martin Unfiltered.